Welcome back to the fifth video in his Yamaha 4-stroke outboard engine series. A stumble heard at all RPM ranges brought us to the carburetors through troubleshooting, which we removed from the engine in part 1. Part 2 involved disassembly of the components. Carburetor 4 was disassembled, inspected, cleaned, and reassembled in great detail. Chapter 3 started off with some needed repairs on Carb 4. This also introduced the project of the cold start valves that were disassembled, cleaned, tested for resistance, as well as current draw functionality before the device was reassembled with new seals. Jets from 1 and 3 were swapped. We moved on to the accelerator pump hose issue requiring complete disassembly. We found it also needed to be cleaned, and the new hose was installed, the accelerator pump reassembled, bringing us to Chapter 4, where all mating surfaces were cleaned and prepped, O-rings removed and then replaced where appropriate. Mild modifications allowed for better hose fastenings. One O-ring sizing issue caused the cleaning and reuse of O-rings on the carburetors. Brackets and then mounting then commenced with the carburetors temporarily held in place by an M6 nut, at which point the final bracket was then installed. The carburetors would check that the O-ring seated properly, with everything then torqued down to around 9 foot-pounds. The rest of the hoses then added, cable ties applied where appropriate. This was followed by the installation of the accelerator pump and all the associated hoses to the carburetors, which brought us to the carburetor linkage, completing this portion of the project. And we're going to kick things off with just a little preparation on this carburetor. I've had some hoses arrive that I'd like to replace now, part 90445-10 Mike 43. So I'm going to snip off the cable ties, pull back the protective outer hoses from the hoses I'm going to remove. And I'm just going to remove one at a time, because once I pull it from the protective outer hose, I want to size the new one against the old one. I don't want to mix them up. So once I size it, I'll cut it, spray a bit of oil on the outside of the hose, push it through the protective hose, reconnect it to the T-fitting, and secure it with a cable tie. This process will then be repeated, exact same procedure with the other hose. It's time to set the 4 pilot screws on the carburetors. They're currently set to the fully closed position. And I'll just be scratching a little shine into each of them so I know where the screw position is on the start, so I know how far to turn them. 1, 2, and 3 are going to be set to 2 1/4 turns, and number 4 is going to be set to 2 1/2. So we'll kick things off with 1/2, 1, 1/2, 2 1/4. Again, 1/2, 1, 1/2, 2 1/4. 1/2, 1, 1/2, 2 1/4. And this one's a little different. 1/2, 1, 1/2, 2 1/2. Next, we need to pull a piece out of the engine, so we're going to open up the cover now. And I want to pull off this throttle linkage and measure it, because I don't know if the measurement is correct. We may have to adjust it. We'll find out. With a flathead screwdriver, I pry it right off of that linkage and take it into the garage. I'm setting my calipers for 144 millimeters. Then I lock them down. And I'm checking center to center here, and this thing is dead on, so no adjustments. I'm just going to go and clean this thing up and make sure that I don't turn it, because it's perfect. And I'm going to put this right back in the boat where we found it. Pressing it in with the flathead, it snaps into place. Just like that, I push it down and out of the way for the carb install. The fuel filter was disconnected during carb removal. It sat right here. Arrow going in right here comes from the line from the gas tank. Arrow going out makes its way to the pump. I'm going to pull back on these hose clamps because we're going to be removing this filter assembly, working them back one at a time. And now it's removed, we'll take it over to the garage. This thing put up quite a fight to open, especially without trying to break that plastic, but eventually it did come loose, trying to exert even pressure on that as I turned it. And as I opened it up, I could immediately see that that filter's been recently replaced, and we are seeing the same sediment that we saw in the carbs and in the pump, so they probably just added that filter not too long ago, and we could probably reuse this after we clean it. The extra filter that we purchased was for a 6D8, which is a different model fuel filter assembly, so that's something to keep an eye out for. Make sure you get the right fuel filter. The one marked 6D8 has a different filter in it. So we're just going to do a general cleaning of all of these parts and then leave them out to dry when they're done. Everything cleaned up like new, no worries at all. Sitting out on my windshield in the sun to dry for a couple hours before reinstallation. Part 1, I blocked the intake with clean paper towels. I'm going to remove them now because it looks like this mating surface is really dirty and built up with something on there. I'm going to try and clean it with paper towel and carb cleaner, but it looks like I'm getting a run for my money because whatever this is, it's really putting up a fight to come off. This is already about 10 minutes in and it barely came off. I had much more luck with a cotton rag and carb cleaner, but after about another 20 minutes, everything cleaned up perfectly with no residue left behind from whatever that was on there. Also cleaned up any mystery dirt that accumulated behind the carbs. I removed this small breather hose to make installation easier. So this area is all prepped and ready, and this mating surface is all prepped and ready, and I gotta remove these screws now, so I'm gonna take them out, put them off to the side somewhere safe. Pull out the electrical cables I stored in here, let them drop to the ground, push that throttle linkage back down to the bottom, and all these bolts come to the garage to be cleaned, going into a bowl with some carb cleaner. I'll give it a shake and some agitation to remove all the dirt from them. And there it is. I'll pull the oil dipstick now, have a paper towel at the ready, clean it off and put it off to the side. Temporarily blocking the dipstick port with a clean piece of paper towel. This electrical cable going to the carbs, what I want to do is disconnect it from the back, this unfortunate location of a connector, because I want to apply some deoxit to this connector while I can reach it. So I'm just going to spray some in the connector, spray some in the cable, and then I'm just going to reconnect it now. I'll leave this hanging out of the engine. Cable's ready, throttle linkage is ready, dipstick removed, everything here cleaned, intake ports cleaned, breather hose removed. I think we're ready. Last thing, keeping one mounting bolt at the ready. Without any obstructions around, it's very easy to bring the airbox carburetor assembly around. That top fuel hose I want to bring through this hole here above that second tube, pull it through, the bottom one just hangs there, and line everything up to those pins, situated just like this. We could see an alignment pin down here, one up here, and we make sure that all of our O-rings are still seated, and then we seat the assembly up against the manifold. I hold it in position as I take that one screw and screw it into the top just to hold everything together so it doesn't fall off when I let go. And when everything's lined up, the screw should turn in by hand with zero effort. I brought that electrical cable forward and pushed it into the groove with a screwdriver. We could see it fitting into that groove now. It's important it sits in that groove because it holds it away from those teeth right there. I'm going to add this bolt to the bottom now. That way it's supported on the top and bottom. The O-rings don't have a chance to come loose anymore. Screwing it all the way in, hand tightened. I then add all of the other bolts, which will be hand tightened. And that means just the removal of slack. We're not trying to tighten down these bolts yet. And with our 10 mil, we're going to start progressively tightening from the middle bolts outward. I'm actually doing 2 rounds. So about 3 or 4 foot-pounds I'm doing until they're tightened from the middle outward. And then I'm starting again from the middle, tightening to about 6 or 7 foot-pounds. I'm doing it by feel. If you want to use a torque wrench, use a torque wrench. Now I'll re-add the 2 bolts that support the air silencer. Again using a 10 mil to draw out all the slack from the bolts. I'll tighten down both of these to 6 or 7 foot-pounds. Remember, we're going into plastic. Now I'll remove my paper towel covering the hole for the oil dipstick and reinsert the oil dipstick back into position. Lifting up the throttle linkage, I align it to the hole, and when it's aligned, I push it in and then using a screwdriver I snap the nylon lock into position. This bolt here held on the fuel filter removed in chapter 1. I'll remove the bolt now. The parts are now dried for the fuel filter. I'll reassemble it, pressing the filter into the housing. I then take the bottom and screw it back on, just snugging it down, not tightening it with vice grips like I found it. Placing it into position, I tighten down the bolt and snug it with a 12mm socket. Now I connect the hose from the tank to the arrow marked pointed inward, pushing it all the way up onto the fuel filter, followed by the hose clip into position and off to the side. Connection marked in from the pump will go to the arrow marked out from the fuel filter. I push that hose all the way up, pulling the clip up into position. I push it off to the side. Tank to the input, output to the input of the pump. Now I'll take the top hose from the carburetor and put the hose clamp back on it. Plugging into the top port of the fuel pump, we can see this hose goes right back up here. Seat the hose all the way in, and then set the clamp into position, and then push the clamp around back. That one is done. Bottom hose will go to the middle port on the fuel pump. Same procedure. Drop on the clamp, seat the hose onto the connector, and then run up the hose clamp. All 3 hoses now connected, clamps pointed backwards. This portion of the project is now done. I'll reinstall the breather hose. The book says to put it under this hose from the carburetor, but I just don't see that in this situation. I think there was a protective hose around that other hose, so I'm going to put it over it and push this hose back into position, just like that. I think that's better. And I'll be using a medium-sized cable tie on both sides of this hose. So I'm going to do the first one up top, bending that cable tie away so that it doesn't come into interference with those teeth right there. And then the other side. And that hose is done. I'm going to hit these connections with some deoxit before they're reconnected. And then connect them back up, correct color code, by pair, short to long, long to short. Once connected, I'll get them all into position so they can be cable tied down properly. The cable coming from the back sits in this notch and the other one's cable tied to it. I just need one more over here. And that should be good. So we got our fuel pump rebuilt, our fuel filter rebuilt, our carbs and all associated hardware rebuilt, accelerator pump rebuilt, throttle linkage measured, intake mating surfaces cleaned up, electrical wiring and connectors has had deoxit applied. Let's continue. I've put a T on my carburetor synchronizers so I can make sure that they're calibrated. I'm going to hit them with the vacuum pump. Everything here seems to be working good. I run into a problem with the outer ones because the supplied reducers are a different size than the ones I use on my motorcycles. So we could see that there's going to be an issue with these, but we're going to see what happens. So I'm just going to set everything up and we'll take it over to the boat. I've ramshackled the holder together to keep the carb synchronizer here while I work. I think this will be okay for testing purposes.
Okay, go ahead.
I want to check the full throttle stop first right quick. So we're in full throttle now.
Cool, thank you.
And I'm taking my feeler gauge, and I don't really need to because I know it's good, but just to demonstrate, this is a 0.5mm gauge. The gap should be less than 0.5mm, and it doesn't fit. My 0.2mm gauge doesn't fit, so this is good. And that's because I measured out that throttle linkage. I want to pre-open and retighten these 4 vacuum ports before we heat up the engine, just in case there's a problem. Right now the engine is cool, it's easy to deal with, but I can see these are just fine. And this one up top was completely loose, not tight at all, not good. And I'm just going to come back and snug them all back down. We already have a tachometer on this engine, so I don't need to get one from the garage. And here's all the screws that we'll be adjusting once the engine warms up. Prime it first. A couple of tries, bowl fills, and checks to get it going. Remember, the bowls are dry. The engine is running. There is nothing set up properly yet on this engine. What I'm trying to do is simply maintain it at a proper RPM and keep it running long enough to warm it up so I can shut it off. And I'm just trying to keep the idle around 1000 RPM until it comes to temperature. This is about 5 to 7 minutes. Also checking for gas leaks, fires, melting, that sort of smoke test sort of thing. We're good. I'm going to remove all 4 ports at once right now because at this point I haven't seen that it's not really going to work well. So we'll see what happens when I get everything connected and then fire up the engine.
Go ahead.
And we can see this is the problem. I generally use the inside ones for motorcycles and not all 4. But if I went and got the correct brass inserts for these, I would be able to use all 4. So we're going to do 2 at a time, 4 to 3 on the 2 inside ones. And then we're going to do 4 to 2 and then 4 to 1. My brass inserts are so restrictive it takes several seconds for the vacuum to settle. But that's what I need for a motorcycle so we don't see it oscillate from the engine. I want to get my idle down to 1000. I'll be turning the screw to do that, and I'll be doing that a lot as I make these adjustments because these adjustments will shift the idle. And now I'll be working with this screw to balance number 3 to number 4, and number 3 is on the right, so we can see that needle moving while number 4 stays the same. Nice. And now they're set the same.
Okay, shut it off.
Then I'll set everything up for 2 to 4 balancing, adjusting with this screw.
Hit it.
Speed all this up. The process is the same to make sure that both gauges are equal, adjusting the right gauge to match the left.
Next.
And finally, number 1 to number 4. And that's it. The balancing is done.
Shut it off.
I did go back and re-verify all of them, but everything was good. So all these ports are now normaled up and snugged down. This is now accelerator pump engagement. That metal linkage to the accelerator pump should push through the slop and start hitting the accelerator pump, start depressing it at 2700 RPM. And this screw adjusts it so that happens. So I'm going back and forth and giving it gas to see visually that where that plastic piece starts pushing in on the accelerator pump. I know there's a slight stumble left and one of these screws is just a little bit off. I'm turning them one at a time, Rich, to see which one it is and then setting it back, and it turns out it's off camera, but it's the top one needed an adjustment, and that's all there was to it to take out that stumble. Those adjustments done, I do the final setting of the idle RPM.
I think this boat is fine at 1000.
And we test it out because this engine's done, it's ready to go. No misses, no stumbles, no weird sounds. Everything sounds good. No more smoke and popping coming out of the exhaust as it idles. The final test obviously is going to be on the water. So now I place the plastic cover back on, snapping everything into place on the back and then the front. Here's the valve clearance measurement, by the way. There could be a video, link in the top right corner. The tachometer is placed back on the Velcro as I take one more cable tie.
Back in my day.
And fasten down the slack.
Last cable tie, I swear.
All that's left is to close it up and take it out on the water. And that concludes the last video in this series on this Yamaha 4-stroke outboard engine, carburetor rebuild, fuel pump rebuild, and all sorts of other work and things repaired on this engine. I hope you found this video enjoyable, entertaining, and informative. Do me a favor, hit that like button down below, helps me out a lot when you do, and hit that subscribe button for more videos like this when they come out. If another video like this comes out in the series, a link will be posted in the top right corner. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. Would you like to reply?
It's got that